Troy 6 represents the time of the Trojan War. And once again, there are many similarities between this defensive ditch and one Homer describes in the Iliad.
If you look at his description of the fortification ditch that's dug around the Greek camp, and then you look at the fortification ditch that we found, certainly that's a striking similarity between the two. It's actually quite likely that this is the site that Homer had in mind when he put down the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Over the years, Kaufmann and his team discovered religious totems for worship of Trojan gods. Spindles for weaving the fine fabrics traded by Troy through the ancient world. Enemy spear tips and arrowheads embedded in the walls of Troy. Coins from the time of Alexander the Great, and a bust of the Roman Emperor Augustus, who traced his lineage back to Troy. But despite the incredible discoveries, one find continued to elude Kaufmann, just as it had Schliemann. Where was evidence of the huge city as described by Homer?
One of the more important things we want to know about Troy is how large the settlement was in different points in time, at different periods, and how it grew, how it shrank, and if there were different activities going on in different areas or parts of the settlement. We can't answer this by excavation alone.
To discover the elusive vastness of the city described by Homer, Kaufmann's team employed a technique that more resembled farming than archaeology: site survey.
Every 20 meters, we remove the vegetation to get conditions similar to a freshly plowed field. We collect everything we find there. Pottery and tile fragments, whatever is lying around. Just get an idea about settlement size and function of different areas.
All finds were brought back to camp, where artifacts were washed, classified, and dated. Thousands of shards representing thousands of years.
This year we covered about 15 hectares, about 400 points, and we collected more than 100,000 items from there, about 2 tons of material.
A significant quantity of the shards are from the Bronze Age, particularly the time just before the Trojan War.
We can see how the area all the way to this ditch and in the east, and where this ditch was covered by a Bronze Age settlement.
Pieces of the Trojan War Age pottery extended over a quarter of a mile out from the walled city of Troy, all the way to the defensive ditch. This ditch, described by Homer as built by the Greeks to defend their ships, was more likely a ditch built by the Trojans to defend Troy against the Greeks. Kaufmann was confident that this area, from the ditch to the fortified walls of the citadel, was a vast lower city, more than 5 acres, that with the temples and palaces of the citadel comprised the glorious city of Troy. This then would be a Troy large enough to match Homer's, and rich enough for the Greeks to want to conquer.
We archaeologists have in Troy the proof and the hints that this place always was fortified, again and again. It was always rich enough to defend itself. There were always enemies enough who wanted to have that place. For us, this is enough argument to say that there always had been war at this place.
Nearly 3,000 years after Homer, Manfred Kaufmann had finally proved that the city of Troy did exist. But where is the evidence of the Trojan War? what was it really fought over? Are we to believe Homer's claim that a woman, the most beautiful woman in the world, caused the destruction of Troy? To the ancient Greeks, beauty was order, exemplified in the naked body. Youthful and round, with tapered waist, high conical breasts, and curvaceous thighs. Surely Helen was all this, and her kidnapping, an attack on world order, was an act of war against the Greeks. But her abduction was also a personal affront against a very powerful ruler. Even today, it's conceivable how that can contribute to an international war.
This is the guy that tried to kill my dad at one time.
How did the balance of personal versus political play out in the true story of Troy?
The legend of Helen being abducted and from that the war flowed is not impossible, but it's unlikely as a sole cause.
Brigadier General John Brown of the U.S. Army is an expert on ancient warfare.
What's more likely is that there was an opportunity waiting to happen, a war that was awaiting a cause. There was a instinct for expansion on the part of the Mycenaeans that provided an underpinning that needed a triggering event. Helen being abducted would very readily have been a kind of a triggering event that could have galvanized the warriors of such an age into an effort to redeem their reputation and increase their glory.
Homer tells us of a coalition of Mycenaean Greeks under the leadership of Agamemnon crossing the Aegean in 1,000 ships to wage war on Troy sometime around 1250 BC. How does Homer's account compare with modern military strategy?
A quarrel over women who were stolen in one of these acts of piracy whereby...
Acting as military chief of staff to Agamemnon, General Brown assembled his staff. Intelligence, operations, logistics, and personnel, all to wage war on the enemy, the Trojans.
Gentlemen, we've been asked to do an operational analysis of the Trojan War to try to come to grips with the campaign imperatives that affected both the Mycenaeans, or Greeks, and the Trojans in the course of the campaign.
The first order of business was what's at stake: the control of the seaborne trade route critical to the commercial economy of the ancient world.
Strategic setting is dominated by the necessity of controlling trade routes. One I'd like to call your attention to in particular, and the one that affects our story, is the one running from the Black Sea through the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and out the Dardanelles. That's precisely the location of Troy.
Troy's location gave it control of the trade route from east to west, access not only to the breadbasket of Western Asia, but also treasures of gold, spices, and luxury goods. A shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey in 1984, dating from the time of the Trojan War, is testimony to the riches at stake. Treasures from 7 civilizations were aboard the ship. Gold medallions from Egypt, urns of oil and spices from the Far East, ox-hide-shaped ingots of tin from Central Asia, and copper from Cyprus. The exact proportions for making bronze: 10 parts copper, 1 part tin.
Bronze is made from tin and copper. When you control your access to those materials, you're controlling the industrial materials of the Bronze Age.
Controlling bronze production in the Bronze Age was the same as controlling oil in the Oil Age. If the Greeks wanted to become an empire, they needed Troy.
If you turn from that strategic setting to the operational level. They had no choice.
Again, Brigadier General John Brown and his staff applied modern military planning to the ancient battles of the Trojan War.
From a personnel point of view, what would you tell me about the layout if this represents the Mycenaean capability and this area right here, Troy?
Troy's population did not compare in military manpower to the Greek state allied against it.
The Greeks assembled a coalition army to outnumber the Trojans 5-1. They'd need that overwhelming force to ensure a quick, decisive victory, and to deliver that force, Homer says the Greeks sailed to Troy in 1,000 black-bowed ships.
Is there anything we should know from an intelligence point of view?
Well, a couple things I'd like to point out, sir. First, as you know, Troy is a heavily fortified city. It's got a strong and a high wall. If we allow them to get behind that wall, that means we're going to have to lay siege to them. Also, they have a series of potential allies that if we alienate them, could come down on the side of the Trojan.
Well, given that intelligence backdrop, what do you think the operation should look like?
The Greeks should land directly before Troy and either defeat them on the battlefield in open combat with our overwhelming force or starve them out of their walled city.
Overwhelming force delivered directly to the shores of Troy in 1,000 ships. The Greeks were poised to recapture Helen, restore their honor, and gain power and wealth by controlling the most important trade route of the Bronze Age. It was a simple enough plan. One last logistical consideration. How were they going to feed 1,000 ships full of warriors?
What's your thoughts there, logistician?